Good afternoon, everybody. Today, I'm going to introduce to you the two books of Plutarch that we are going to read in the next 2 weeks, namely the Life of Solon and the Life of Lycurgus. This time round, I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to use as a guide for myself to make sure that my presentation is done in an orderly fashion and that you can follow more easily. Do not expect in the slides to find all that I'm going to say. Most of what I'm going to say is going to be said impromptu. So please pay attention to the video. And given the fact that you have the video at your disposal, you can re-watch it as many times as you want. I'll start now sharing the video, the screen with the slides, hoping that everything goes well. All right, here we are. I hope you can see my slides. Plutarch's Lives of Solon and Lycurgus. First of all, let me say a few words of why we are now passing to this author, Plutarch, namely, who lived many centuries before Thomas More. In fact, he lived 1,400 years before Thomas More. Plutarch, of course, didn't speak English. He was not a Christian. He spoke Greek and knew some Latin, given the fact that he spent some of his life in Rome, the capital of the empire. At this time, Christianity was already spreading, but it was a minor religion. So in many ways, Plutarch is culturally radically different from Thomas More and the kind of world in which Thomas More lived. So why this jump back into the past? Well, the reason is that Plutarch and his work have been a great source of inspiration for writers like Thomas More himself. During the period in which Thomas More lived, and other people lived, like his friend Erasmus, for example, the works of Plutarch, along with the work of other authors, such as Plato, for example, or Thucydides or Herodotus, namely the authors of ancient Greek literature and philosophy, were being rediscovered. Particularly, the works of Plutarch are represented in many ways a model to fashion the ideal virtuous men, and along with it, the ideal virtuous and harmonious society. That's why we are now jumping to Plutarch. So who was Plutarch? Plutarch was a Greek aristocratic man, a Greek nobleman, living in the first part of the first century, in the second part of the first century AD, under the reign of the Emperor Nero. In other words, when Plutarch lived, Rome had already conquered almost the entirety of its empire and was the superpower of the Mediterranean. In the Roman Empire, the two languages of culture were Greek on the one hand and Latin on the other. Greek, from the cultural point of view, had a predominance in that Greek culture, even though politically subjugated, conquered by the Romans, had then culturally conquered the conqueror. Plutarch, as I told you, was a nobleman. He was a priest of Lord Apollo in Delphi, and he was also interested in philosophy. Particularly, he considered himself to be part of the Platonic philosophical tradition. And in that capacity, as namely a Platonist, He wrote many small essays against the Stoics and the Epicureans above all, and sometimes against Aristotle. Sorry. He wrote a big corpus of works that cover a variety of themes and which are gathered under the title of moralia, or in Greek, ηθικά. That is to say, things that have to do with ways of being, ways in which one should be. His other main work are the parallel lives. And the two lives that we're reading in these 2 weeks are part of this other body of work, namely the parallel lives. Parallel between what and what? The parallel lives are a series of lives of famous and important Greek historical characters on the one side, and famous and important Roman historical characters on the other side. That is to say, characters that have marked history. In this case, we're reading two Greek lives, the lives of two Greeks. One is that of Solon. The other one is that of Lycurgus. So we're not reading the life of Solon in parallel with the life with which it should go, namely the life of Romulus, the founder of Rome. We're reading it in parallel with Lycurgus. Why? Because Solon was in many ways the founder of what would then become Athenian democracy, the first democracy in the world, whereas Lycurgus was the organizer of the first constitutionally settled oligarchy in the world, namely Sparta. And because Athens and Sparta represented in the Greek world the two possible paradigms of governance. And these two paradigms have accompanied the history of the development of political thought in the European tradition ever since, with the idea of democracy in the past 100 years prevailing. That's why we read these two lives in parallel. Let's go back a second to Plutarch as a historical character. I told you that Plutarch lived in the 1st century AD, so in the 1st century of our era. However, the two characters that he talks about, and the vast majority of characters he talks about, lived way before him, particularly these two. As we will see, Solon lived between the 7th and 6th century BC, whereas Lycurgus might have been even more ancient than Solon, having lived allegedly between the 9th and the 8th century BC. What is it that Plutarch does in presenting the lives of these two men? Well, precisely what he wants to do is provide a paradigm for what a savvy, capable, virtuous statesman should be like, and at the same time to try and describe two political paradigms that have been there in history. So we're not dealing anymore with a utopia, we're dealing with factual political systems that have been in use in a certain part of the world in a certain time period. Why writing a life? What is a biography? I like to quote Benedetto Croce, an Italian philosopher of the 20th century, who writes, biography, serious, great biography, when it rises to the level of history, sublimates itself and coincides with the history of the work of which the individual has been the representative and the symbol. And when it remains mere biography, it decays to the level of chronicle or becomes a psychological typification to which collaborates imagination as, and the word sounds almost ironical, an integrating instrument. What is Croce saying here? That when biography doesn't limit itself to just depict the psychological traits of a character, when it doesn't limit itself to just give us the description of a life, as typical as this life might be, when biography doesn't do that, then it becomes great biography. And what is it that it does when it becomes great biography? Well, a great biography is the one in which the character whose life is being depicted coincides with the work that that character has represented and of which it has been a symbol. In other words, the life of Solon, the life of Lycurgus are worth reading, not because we want to know the feelings of Solon. In fact, there is no trace of that in the life of Solon that Plutarch writes, but because the historical character Solon embodies the paradigm that the Athenian democracy tried to be. And same thing with Lycurgus. So the goal of writing a biography for Plutarch is that of giving us living models of a certain way of operating. Models in which the character, the given person, and the work that this character accomplishes identified perfectly. Let's say a few things about Greece, the region in which Athens and Sparta are located. I don't know how well you can see the map of ancient Greece that I gave you here, but this is ancient Greece. As you can notice, compared to modern Greece, ancient Greece spread also on the coast of what today we call Turkey. And in fact, if I took a picture of the map of the entire Mediterranean, you would see that the ancient Greek world spread as far as southern Italy and the coast of southern France and Spain. The Greek world was organized not as a unitary state, but as a series of city-states, each independent from the other, and each oftentimes at war with the other. Now, the heading here reads, Greece, the birthplace of Western culture. Is that an exaggeration? No, it is not an exaggeration. The Western world is the Western world mostly because of Greece, then because of Rome, and then because of Christianity. Christianity has been subsumed in the pre-existent Greco-Roman element. But the foundation of this mixture is the Greek element. The Greeks are the ones who have given the West its literature, the great Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Greece is the one that gave the West the beginning of science, for example, medical science, Hippocrates. Greece is the one that has given the West its architectural forms. If you go visit the part of Singapore near the National Museum or the Asian Civilization Museum, that part of Singapore, namely, that has been built by the British colonizers during the 19th century, you will see there that all the buildings resemble classical Greek buildings or classical Roman buildings, and that's not by chance. And Greece is the place that has given the West philosophy and much of the paradigms out of which, many of the paradigms out of which later political thinking in the West will develop. So saying that Greece is the birthplace of Western culture is far from being an exaggeration. Let's go now to the two characters. So Solon, as I was telling you, Solon lived between 638 BC and 552 BC in Athens. Whereas Lycurgus, we don't know precisely, but we speculate, historians speculate, that he must have lived between the 9th and the 8th century BC. So Lycurgus will be some 150 years older than Solon, if he, by the way, ever existed. Let's look at the two cities or city-states to which they respectively belonged. Solon was an Athenian. In the time in which Solon lived, Athens had already rose to a level of prominence in the Greek world among the other city-states. It wasn't yet the cultural and in many ways economical and political center of Greece as it will become some 150 years after the death of Solon. But it was already one of the most prominent cities in Greece. Solon was born under the so-called tyranny of Pisistratos, who eventually left the power to his two children. After the death of Pisistratos, the children of Pisistratos were not able to govern the city efficiently and sturdily as Pisistratos, their father, had done. So they lost power. One of them was killed and the other one exiled. At that point, Athens entered into a period of turmoil, the end of which was represented, as you might have read in the book, by Solon's political engagement. Let me dwell a second on this idea of tyranny. When we think of the word tyrant, because Pisistratos was a tyrant, a tyrannos in Greek, we think of someone who rules despotically, who rules violently and against the will of the people. Was that what Pisistratos was? No, not at all. Greek city-states had been governed during that period, in many cases, by tyrants. What does tyrant mean in Greek? Tyrannos. It means intermediator. Intermediator between whom and whom? Between the aristocracy, the landed owners, and the people who had nothing, or at least were not as rich as the aristocracy. So the mediator between a very few and the vast majority. The very few being a community of rich men capable of bearing arms and using them, so being a community of warriors, tended to vex and take advantage of the majority. The majority, though, didn't remain passive. What resulted was what in Greek is called stasis, that is to say, internal war, or how we call it now, civil war, war among inhabitants of the same place. A tyrant was a mediator between these two extremes. And oftentimes, a tyrant emerged out of a disgraced aristocratic family, which started portraying itself as protector of the majority, of the poor people. It is no chance that the sons of Pisistratos were one killed and the other exiled from Athens by two members of the landed aristocracy, not by the lower people. And what happened when the Athenian aristocracy managed to get back in its hands the power that it had lost under Pisistratos? Well, it happened that the Athenian aristocracy reinstated again the same kind of vexatorial measures and mechanisms that had been in place before the advent of Pisistratos' tyranny. Hence, civil strife ensued. Solon came to put a remedy exactly to this situation of constant inner conflict. Let's go now to Sparta. We'll come back later on to Solon and Athens. Sparta. You might know, or at least some of you know, the name of Sparta because of this rather inaccurate, to be generous, movie called 300. I've chosen an image out of that movie because I couldn't find any image of Sparta itself. And that's because Sparta has left no remains. Something, by the way, that the great Greek historian Thucydides had predicted. Sparta was, as Athens, one of the most prominent cities of archaic Greece already. And in fact, in the period in which we're talking about, unlike Athens, Sparta had already risen to a sort of pan-Hellenic, that is to say, covering all of Greece, prominence. Why? Because of its militaristically oriented political system. What was Sparta? Before the arrival onto the scene of Lycurgus, like Athens, also Sparta had seen a lot of inner civil strifes. For the same reasons that Athens had seen them. What does Lycurgus do when he arrives? He solidifies the ruling class into one block kept together by strict communal rules, whereby everybody is equal, and everybody is equal as member of the army, as soldier. In doing so, Lycurgus is exploiting a phenomenon that had been underway during the period right before his birth, namely the emergence of the character, of the figure of the citizen soldier. That is to say, what had happened a few decades before the birth of Lycurgus all throughout the Greek world. It had happened that citizens started developing the consciousness of being such, of being equal citizens, because they all participated into the wars as soldiers. And they participated into the wars of soldiers as soldiers through a spirit of camaraderie, in order to fight, you to be united. In the battlefield, we're all equal. There is no rich and no poor. We're all soldiers. Out of this new spirit that emerged from the battlefield and from the experience of war, a new consciousness of what being together meant emerged. Being together means to be equal because we share the same dangers. So Lycurgus exploited this new mentality that was emerging and solidified the fighting class of Sparta into one elite group, which besides the bondage of the arms, had also the bondage of ethnicity, of blood. The Spartiates, that is to say, the elite of Sparta, deemed themselves to be descendant, nonetheless, of the god, the semi-god Heracles. So Lycurgus used this ethnic, semi-mythical bond, together with the bond created already in the previous decades by the emergence of this new figure of the soldier citizen, to create an elite of warriors which formed an inner society within the larger Spartan society. Below this elite of warriors, there were the ones who did not participate into the fighting effort, and those were the merchants. They didn't enjoy the same political rights as the military elite. And further down, there were the ilotes, that is to say, the descendants of those people that the Spartiates, when they arrived in the Peloponnese, that is to say, in the region that they occupy, in Laconia, the Spartiates had subdued. So what Lycurgus does is to placate, to put an end to the civil strifes by creating a hierarchical society organized in castes, at the top of which there is this warrior caste. Now, this warrior caste in its inside was also hierarchically organized. At the bottom, there is the large base of the citizens warriors. Among them, then, an assembly of elderly counselors would be selected. And on top, there were the two kings. The two kings had to respond to the assembly of the elderly, the Gerousia, it was called. The Gerousia expressed also another intermediary body, political body, called ephori. The ones, that is to say, that worked as intermediaries between the Gerousia, the council of the elderly, and the base on the one hand, the Gerousia and the kings on the other. This political hierarchy was also mirrored in some kind of status hierarchy in the elite? No. In the Spartan elite, everybody was equal, both in terms of rights and in terms of possessions. The Spartiate, the member of the Spartan elite, didn't possess money. The Spartans used some kind of vile metal in order to have money when they started having money. Everybody belonging to the elite possessed the same amount of land allotted by the state, which was enough for a family to feed itself on. And the male members, on top of it, to strengthen this communal bond, the male members of the Spartan elite didn't have the right to eat at home, but they had to eat together in order to solidify this bond of unity. So what you have in Sparta is a caste society, on top of which there is this military caste, within which what obtains is total equality. That's Sparta for you. And Sparta remained identical to itself down to the 4th century BC and a bit beyond. So if you calculate from the time of Lycurgus, Sparta didn't change for almost 500 years, which is quite a feat. Let's go now again to Athens, okay? Athens is the first democracy of the world. Sparta, instead, is a military oligarchy. In many ways, is the first codified example of an oligarchy. Let's look at these two words. Of all, the word democracy is a word that everybody knows and everybody uses without knowing what it means. So everybody abuses. Let's look a moment at what it means in terms of its etymology, and then we'll go and see how problematic this concept of democracy is. Democracy, from ancient Greek, demokratia, which is a compound word of demos plus kratos. Demos means people, kratos means power. So the power of the people. Democracy means the political regime, that political regime in which power is in the hands of the people. Let's pause here a second and go back to Solon. If you read the Life of Solon, you will know that this definition of democracy doesn't quite fit with what Solon did. What did Solon do? He divided up Athenian society according to income classes, classes based on income and material goods. So in a way, also Solon created a sort of hierarchical society. These different classes, though, did not constitute castes. Why? Well, because if you were born in a lower economical class and you made a fortune during your life, you would go into the next class. Whereas if in Sparta you were born as a merchant, or even worse, as an ilot, as a slave, there would be no way for you to go to the next higher up class. So in Athens, we're not dealing with castes, yet we're dealing with some kind of hierarchy defined by census, defined by income, by economical possessions. And linked to this was also the ability to exercise political rights and vote. The richer you were, the more your political participation weighed. Is this really a democracy the way we understand it today? No. But it's already something much more advanced than someone like Stuart Mill at the end of the 19th century was willing to accept. Today we say that England and the US are by default democratic nations. Well, go look at the history of England. It is true that before all other European nations, it has implemented a democratic system, but it did so quite late, and sometimes not really before all other modern nations. In any case, that's another story. This is just to say, though, that the kind of democracy which we think we have today, whereby each vote has the same value as anybody else's vote, we think that democracy works this way, but it's just a fiction of the mind. In fact, well, this system is something fairly recent. In fact, we can trace it back, in most cases, to the end of the Second World War. Compared to what you had in Europe 120 years ago, the system put together by Solon was already fairly close to the ideal of democracy, so to say, the ideal in which the people is the source of power. But it wasn't exactly the case for Solon organization of Athenian political life either. Let's look now at the word oligarchy. It's another Greek word. I told you at the beginning of the course that the main concepts around which the West has developed its ideas come from Greece. So this just shows what I was saying to you. Oligarchia, oligi plus archi, the few, oligi, plus control, government. Oligarchy hence means the political regime in which power, the government, control, is in the hands, sorry, I should have written, I wrote end, of a few. Now, two problems. And with this, I want to wrap things up. I want to throw these problems at you for you to discuss them in class and to think about them. In fact, three problems, not two. Does people by default mean the majority? Who are the people? Let's look at the Athenian case. Demos in Athens means people. But who are the people? If we read Xenophon, the author, or the pseudo-Xenophon, we don't know, the author in any way of the Constitution of the Athenians, not the one by Aristotle, the one by the so-called pseudo-Xenophon, this author says straightforward that, well, democracy means these people that you talk about, these demos that you talk about, is in fact the worst part of the city. Why? Who are these people? The poorest of the poor, the dispossessed of everything. And what do? Are they the majority? That's why they govern? No. They govern because they are the ones that push forward the economical and political power of Athens, because they are the sailors. So in this case, people means what? Means a certain social class, the poor. But the poor are not necessarily the majority. But they might be, though, that social group that exerts more pressure on the rest of society. And when in Athens democracy worked in its most splendid way during the period of Pericles, the 5th century, the end of the 5th century BC, was it really a government of the people? Well, no. It was the government of Pericles and his counselors, who ruled on behalf of the people. So as Polybius, another Greek historian, very aptly said, the so-called Athenian democracy was an oligarchy, the oligarchy of Pericles and his political faction, the aristocracy, which held power with the consent, with the permission, with the backing up of the majority. So in this case, the people become who? The few that are in power. You see how complicated this concept of democracy to pin down is. Let's observe another thing about this Athenian democracy. The Athenian democracy was such, that is to say, it guaranteed at least nominal equality to all Athenians, born of Athenians and born male. Women in Athens had no political right whatsoever. Foreigners who were free men and had been living in Athens, maybe were even born in Athens, but were not of Athenian blood, had no political rights whatsoever, nor could they acquire them. Not to talk about the mass of slaves and completely dispossessed people who lived in Athens. To give you some numbers, some figures, in a city that at the peak of its democratic development, the end of the 5th century BC, counted something like 150 to 100,000 people total. The Athenians with political rights, so the Athenians enjoying democracy, were at most 20, 30,000, no more than that. And this total democracy, at least nominal total democracy, enjoyed by these 20, 30,000, was possible on the back of this vast majority who didn't enjoy any political right. And moreover, on the back of all the other Greek city-states that Athens, in the previous 50 years, had ruthlessly subdued. So again, what does people mean precisely? Question number 2, linked to the first one. Can it be that the people correspond to the few of an oligarchy? If you ask the Spartans or the Spartiates, we should say, of course, yes, the people are just the Spartiates. But by the way, if we think back on what I just said about Athens, isn't it the case that also the 20, 30,000 Athenians enjoying this nominal total democracy, isn't it the case that they were also a few, hence an oligarchy? Pretty much like the Spartiates. And in this case, even sharing with the Spartiates the fact that you could not become an Athenian, you had to be born Athenian and male. And finally, if the answer to question 2 is true, then what's the difference exactly between Athens and Sparta? Now, reflect on these questions. If you go deep into these questions, you can bring them to question also what we mean today by democracy. And if you look around at examples of democracy here in the US, in Europe, in Japan, wherever there is a democracy, you will notice that the boundary between oligarchy and democracy is not so well defined. And maybe democracy, hence, is just an empty word, just a chimera. It could be. And the real reality, the actual reality, is that of oligarchies. It could be. If you want to go deeper into this and have instruments to think of this problem in its historical spectrum, so to say, so down to our days, I would like to suggest to you to read this book. I bet you can find it also online. It's a book by the Italian historian Luciano Canfora. To my mind, is one of the most brilliant and sharpest minds living today. The guy is quite old. The title of the book, translated in English, is Democracy in Europe, a History. Is this book here. And I conclude with a picture of Luciano Canfora. With this, I end my lecture today. If you have questions, email me. As I said, you can rewatch the video lecture as many times as you want. And have a good week. See you next time. Bye.